He wasn't supposed to cry like that. Not here, not now, not in front of a stranger who hadn't even said a word. The drizzle had just started, soft and thin, the kind that barely shows on the pavement but leaves everything smelling of wet concrete and rust, and the bus stop sat quiet at the edge of a narrow street in Newcastle, a flickering light buzzing overhead like it couldn't decide whether to stay or give up. Ethan Callahan stood with one hand resting loosely on the lead, his other arm bare despite the cool air, the ink of a German shepherd etched along his right forearm dark against pale skin, the lines worn but steady, like a promise he never broke. Rex sat beside him, still as stone, ears forward, eyes fixed on something Ethan hadn't noticed yet. There was no bark, no warning, no tension in the leash. Just stillness. And then it came, low and quiet. A sound Ethan had never heard from him before, not in the years since they'd walked out of dust and silence together, not in the long nights when sleep didn't come and memory did. It wasn't fear. It wasn't pain. It was something deeper, something that didn't belong to the present moment at all. Rex made a sound that broke in the middle, like it didn't know how to exist in the open air. Ethan frowned, glancing down, giving the lead a gentle pull. "Easy, mate," he murmured, voice calm, automatic, the way you speak when you expect everything to settle back into place. But Rex didn't move. The dog's body shifted, not forward, not defensive, but back, just half a step, weight lowering as if the ground itself had changed beneath him. That was when Ethan saw him. A man stepping off the bus, the door hissing shut behind him, shoes hitting the damp pavement with a soft, measured rhythm. Nothing unusual at first glance. Mid-30s maybe. Tall enough. Jacket zipped halfway. Dark hair damp at the edges from the rain. Just another bloke getting off at the wrong stop on a quiet afternoon. But Rex didn't see just another bloke. Rex leaned back further, not pulling, not resisting, just retreating into himself, and the sound came again, sharper this time, catching in his throat like something remembered too suddenly. Ethan's grip tightened slightly on the lead, not out of fear, but confusion, a slow unease building in the space between what he saw and what Rex felt. "What is it?" he said under his breath, more to himself than the dog, his gaze shifting back to the stranger. The man paused, just for a second, as if he'd felt something too, though no one had spoken. His eyes moved across the empty stop, over the bench, the flickering light, the quiet street, and then landed on Rex. Time didn't stop. It just slowed. Rex's ears dipped. Not flat, not aggressive. Something else. Recognition without certainty. The kind that lives in muscle, not memory. Ethan felt it then, that subtle shift in the air, the kind you only notice when you've spent too long in places where noticing meant surviving. The man's expression didn't change much, just a flicker at the edge of his mouth, something almost like disbelief, or maybe something softer, something he didn't expect to feel. He took a step forward. Rex didn't bark. He didn't growl. He lowered his head, just slightly, eyes locked on the man like he was trying to see through him, past the damp jacket and the quiet face into something older, something buried under time and distance. And then Rex made that sound again, longer this time, breaking all the way through, not loud, not dramatic, just raw in a way that didn't belong to a normal afternoon. Ethan's chest tightened, a memory brushing the edge of his mind without fully forming, like a name you almost remember but can't quite say. Rex had done that once before, just once, and it hadn't ended the way anyone expected. The man stopped a few meters away, close enough now that the rain beaded on his jacket in small, steady lines, close enough that his eyes didn't need to search anymore. He looked straight at Rex, and for a moment, neither of them moved. Not the man, not the dog, not even Ethan. The world didn't fall apart. It just held its breath. And Rex, who had faced storms and silence without breaking, let out a soft, trembling cry that didn't ask for anything, didn't warn of anything, but carried the weight of something that had never truly left. Rex did not move when the man took another step closer, and that was what unsettled Ethan the most. Not the crying, not the strange stillness, but the absence of everything Rex had been trained to do, because Rex was not just a dog that reacted, he was a dog that knew, and right now he was choosing not to act at all, as if something far older than instinct had taken hold of him, something that asked for silence instead of defense. The rain thickened slightly, tapping against the metal roof of the bus stop in a soft, uneven rhythm, and a car passed somewhere down the road, tires hissing against the wet bitumen before fading into the distance, leaving the three of them suspended in a quiet that felt too deliberate to be accidental. Ethan shifted his weight, boots scraping lightly against the damp ground, his gaze flicking between Rex and the man, searching for something ordinary, something that would explain this without forcing him to think too far back. But nothing about this felt ordinary anymore. The man stopped just outside arm's reach, close enough that Ethan could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, the kind that come from years of squinting into sun or dust or memory. And there was something familiar there, not in the face itself, but in the way he held himself, balanced, measured, like someone who had learned long ago that every movement mattered. Rex's breathing changed, shallow now, uneven, and his head lowered another fraction, not in submission, not in fear, but in something that looked almost like recognition he did not trust. Ethan's fingers tightened around the lead, not pulling, just anchoring himself to the moment. "You know him?" he asked quietly, the question slipping out before he could stop it, though he knew how it sounded, knew how strange it was to ask that about a dog. But nothing about this felt like it belonged to normal rules. The man's eyes flicked up to Ethan for the first time, and there it was again, that flicker, like a memory trying to surface through layers of time. He did not answer straight away. Instead, his gaze dropped back to Rex, steady, searching, as if he was waiting for something from the dog rather than the man holding the lead. A second passed, then another. The rain softened again, as if even the sky was unsure whether to continue. "He remembers," the man said finally, voice low, calm, carrying a quiet certainty that did not ask for agreement. Ethan felt something tighten in his chest, a slow, unwelcome recognition of the tone more than the words, because that was not how strangers spoke, not about a dog they had just seen for the first time. Rex let out another sound, softer now, almost a breath rather than a cry, and his tail, which had remained still until now, gave a small, uncertain movement, not wagging, not fully still, just caught between two decisions it could not resolve. Ethan crouched slightly, bringing himself closer to Rex's level, his free hand hovering just above the dog's shoulder before resting there gently, feeling the tension beneath the fur, the subtle tremor that had nothing to do with the cold. "Hey," he murmured, softer this time. The word meant more for grounding than instruction, but Rex did not look at him. His eyes stayed locked on the man. Always the man, as if everything else had faded out of relevance. Ethan followed that gaze again, studying the stranger more closely now, not just the outline but the details, the way the jacket sat slightly off on one shoulder, the faint scar near the jawline, the way his left hand hung just a fraction differently, like it had once been injured and never quite returned to its original rhythm. Something in Ethan's mind shifted, a memory not fully formed but close enough to disturb the surface, like a ripple moving across still water. The man seemed to notice it too, that change in Ethan's expression, because his posture adjusted almost imperceptibly, not defensive, not aggressive, just aware. He was not always called Rex, the man said, still looking at the dog, and the words landed heavier than they should have, not because of what they meant, but because of how easily they were said, as if they belonged to him. Ethan's breath caught for a moment, his hand still resting on Rex's shoulder, feeling the steady rise and fall that was no longer steady at all. There are things you do not question when you have built a life on moving forward, things you leave behind because looking back serves no purpose, but sometimes the past does not stay where you leave it. Sometimes it steps off a bus in the middle of a quiet street and looks straight at you through the eyes of someone else. Rex shifted then, just slightly, not away this time, but forward, one careful step that closed the distance by less than half a meter, his head still low, his gaze unwavering, and Ethan felt the lead loosen in his hand, not because he let go, but because Rex was no longer resisting it. The man's expression softened, just enough to be noticed, and he took a slow breath, as if steadying something inside himself that had been waiting a long time to surface. "Easy, mate," he said quietly, and the words were not directed at Ethan, not really. They were for the dog, spoken in a tone that carried familiarity in a way that could not be faked. Rex's ears twitched at the sound, a subtle, almost invisible reaction, but Ethan saw it, and that was enough to send a sharper edge through the unease building in his chest. Because Rex did not respond like that to strangers. Not ever. The rain eased to a fine mist, the air cooling slightly, carrying that faint scent of wet earth and metal that always comes after the first proper drizzle. And somewhere in the distance, a magpie called, sharp and clear, a sound that felt almost too normal for what was unfolding here. Ethan straightened slowly, his eyes never leaving the man now, the pieces in his mind not yet fitting together but no longer scattered either, forming the outline of something he had not expected to face again. "What do you mean he remembers?" Ethan asked, his voice steady but quieter than before, as if raising it might break whatever fragile truth was starting to reveal itself. The man finally looked at him fully, meeting his gaze without hesitation, and there was no threat there, no challenge, just a weight of something that had been carried for a long time without being spoken. "I mean," he said, choosing the words carefully, "some bonds do not end when you walk away from them." Rex let out one more soft sound, not quite a cry this time, more like a breath released after being held too long, and for the first time since the man had stepped off the bus, he blinked slowly, as if accepting that whatever he was seeing was real, even if it did not belong to the life he had been living. Ethan felt the world shift again, not in a dramatic way, not like something breaking, but like something quietly coming back into place where it had always been, waiting, and in that moment, he understood one thing with a clarity that left no room for doubt. This was not a stranger, not to Rex, and maybe not to him either. Rex moved before Ethan could think, not a sudden lunge, not a burst of instinct, but a slow, deliberate step forward that carried more weight than any command he had ever followed, his body low, careful, as if crossing an invisible line that mattered more than the distance itself, and the lead slipped further through Ethan's fingers until it rested loose, almost forgotten, because whatever held Rex now was not something a hand could guide. The man did not step back, did not brace, did not even shift his stance. He simply watched, breathing steady, eyes soft in a way that suggested this moment had lived somewhere inside him long before it arrived. The space between them closed to less than a meter, and the world seemed to quiet again, the distant hum of traffic fading, the faint drip of rain from the shelter roof slowing to a rhythm that felt almost intentional, like time itself had chosen to move differently here. Rex stopped just short of the man, his head still lowered, his gaze lifting now, searching the face in front of him with a depth that went beyond recognition, beyond memory, into something that felt like confirmation. And then he did something Ethan had not seen since the earliest days, before commands, before structure, before the quiet discipline that had defined their life together. Rex leaned in, not with force, not with urgency, but with a trembling hesitation, his nose brushing lightly against the man's hand as if testing whether it was real, whether it would stay. The man's fingers moved slowly, careful not to startle, and rested gently against the side of Rex's face, the touch light but certain, like it belonged. "There. Easy now," he murmured again, voice softer this time, carrying a familiarity that settled into the air like something long overdue. Rex exhaled, a long, uneven breath that seemed to release something held tight for years, and his body shifted closer, not fully leaning, not surrendering, but no longer holding himself apart. Ethan felt it then, the quiet shift that changed everything, not dramatic, not loud, but undeniable, like a door opening somewhere inside a memory he had locked away without realizing it still had a key. He took a step forward, closing the gap between himself and the moment, his eyes fixed on the man now with a sharper focus, the pieces in his mind aligning just enough to form a question he had not wanted to ask. "What was his name?" Ethan said, his voice steady but edged with something deeper, something that carried both caution and recognition. The man did not look away from Rex as he answered, his hand still resting lightly against the dog's fur, fingers moving just slightly, as if remembering the exact place to touch. "Arlo," he said, and the name hung in the air like it had waited, like it had been waiting to be spoken again. Rex's ears twitched at the sound, a subtle but unmistakable reaction, and his body stilled completely, as if every part of him had paused to listen, to decide, and then his tail gave a small, uncertain movement, not the easy rhythm of comfort, but something tentative, something that asked a question rather than answered one. Ethan's breath caught, not because of the name itself, but because of the way Rex responded to it. Because names are not just sounds to a dog like Rex. They are anchors. They are identity. They are pieces of a past that do not disappear just because you choose to move forward. Ethan's hand dropped slowly to his side, the lead now completely slack, forgotten between them, and for a moment he did not speak, did not move. He simply watched, letting the truth unfold in its own time, because forcing it would not make it clearer. The man finally lifted his gaze to Ethan, and there was no challenge there, no defense, just a quiet acceptance of what this moment meant, of what it would require. "I did not think he would remember," he said, his voice low, almost reflective, as if speaking more to himself than to the man in front of him. Ethan studied him, really studied him now, the lines of his face, the way his shoulders carried a weight that was not visible but present, the subtle tension that had not fully left his posture even in this quiet exchange, and something in Ethan's chest tightened again, not with fear, but with recognition that had finally found its place. "You were there," Ethan said, not a question, not quite a statement, just a piece of truth spoken aloud to see how it would sound. The man gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, and the movement carried more confirmation than any words could. Rex shifted again, pressing his head slightly into the man's hand, the contact firmer now, more certain, but still restrained, as if part of him was holding back, waiting for something else to be resolved before he could fully let go. Ethan stepped closer, closing the distance until he stood just beside Rex, his presence steady, grounding, but no longer guiding, because this was not something he could direct. "You left," Ethan said quietly, and the words were not sharp, not accusatory. They simply existed, carrying the weight of something that had been felt long before it was understood. The man's hand stilled for a moment against Rex's fur, and his gaze dropped briefly, not in shame, not entirely, but in acknowledgement, in the quiet acceptance of something that could not be undone. "I had to," he replied, the words simple, but the space around them filled with everything they did not explain. Rex made a soft sound again, not a cry this time, not a breath, something in between, and he pulled back just slightly, his eyes moving between the two men, as if trying to understand a conversation that did not use his language but still belonged to him. Ethan felt it then, the final piece settling into place, not with clarity, but with certainty, because some truths do not need every detail to be real. He looked at Rex, at the dog who had walked beside him through silence and healing, who had never once looked back, and then he looked at the man, the one who had stepped out of that silence without warning, carrying a past that had never truly ended. The rain had stopped completely now, leaving the air cool and still, the scent of wet earth lingering as the clouds began to thin, and somewhere beyond the quiet street, the light shifted just slightly, enough to remind them that time was still moving, even if this moment felt suspended. Rex stood between them, not choosing, not retreating, simply present, his breathing steadying, his eyes softer now, but still searching, and in that stillness, it became clear that whatever came next would not be decided by commands or memories alone, but by something quieter, something that had waited patiently for this exact moment to arrive. The silence did not break, it settled deeper, like the air itself had decided this moment deserved to be held a little longer, and Ethan could feel it pressing gently against his chest, not heavy, not suffocating, just present, asking him to stay where he was instead of stepping forward too quickly. Rex remained between them, steady now, the tremor gone from his body, replaced by something quieter, something that looked almost like understanding but not quite acceptance, and his eyes moved slowly from the man to Ethan and back again, as if measuring something neither of them could see. The man let his hand fall away, not abruptly, not as a withdrawal, but as a choice, a small movement that carried respect more than distance, and Rex did not follow the hand when it left, which said more than if he had. Ethan noticed that, the way Rex held himself in place, grounded, no longer pulled by the past or anchored only in the present, but standing somewhere in between, and it made something inside Ethan shift in a way he had not expected. "How long?" Ethan asked quietly, his voice steady, not demanding, just searching for a shape to place this moment into. The man took a breath, slow and measured, his gaze drifting briefly past Ethan to the empty stretch of road, as if the answer might be written somewhere out there, carried by the damp wind or hidden in the fading light. Long enough that I stopped thinking he would still be here, he said, and there was no bitterness in his tone, only a quiet acknowledgement of time and the way it moves without asking permission. Ethan nodded slightly, more to himself than to the man, because he understood that kind of time, the kind that stretches and folds until the past feels like something that happened to someone else, until one day it does not. Rex shifted again, but this time it was different, not toward the man, not away, just a small repositioning that brought him closer to Ethan's side, his shoulder brushing lightly against Ethan's leg, a familiar contact, grounding, present, and Ethan's hand found its way back to rest against Rex's neck without thought, fingers settling into the thick fur with a quiet reassurance that needed no words. The man noticed it, the movement, the subtle claim not of ownership but of connection, and something in his expression softened further, not with regret exactly, but with recognition of what had been built in his absence. "He looks after you," the man said, almost as a statement rather than a question, and Ethan let out a small breath, something close to a quiet laugh, but without the sound. "More than I probably deserve," he replied, his voice low, honest in a way that did not ask for agreement. Rex's ear flicked at the sound of Ethan's voice, and his head tilted slightly, just enough to acknowledge without breaking the balance he held between them, and for a moment, everything felt almost ordinary again. Three figures standing under a bus shelter on a damp afternoon, nothing dramatic, nothing urgent, just a pause in the day. But beneath that surface, something else remained, something unresolved, something that would not simply fade once they walked away. The man shifted his weight slightly, his boots making a faint sound against the wet ground, and he looked at Rex again, really looked, as if committing the sight to memory, not because he expected to lose it, but because he understood how easily moments like this could slip away if not held properly. "I called him that because he would not respond to anything else," the man said after a moment, his voice quieter now, reflective. "Arlo, it just stuck." Rex's ears twitched again at the name, but this time there was no confusion in the movement, no hesitation, just a quiet acknowledgement that the sound meant something, even if it no longer defined him completely. Ethan watched that carefully, noting the difference, the way Rex did not lean into the name, did not fully turn toward it, but did not reject it either, and it told him more than any explanation could. "He has not been Arlo for a long time," Ethan said, not as a correction, not as a challenge, just as a truth spoken aloud, and the man nodded, a small, accepting movement. "I can see that," he replied, and there was no resistance in his voice, no attempt to claim something that had changed, only an understanding that names, like people, do not always stay the same. The light shifted again, the clouds thinning enough to let a pale stretch of afternoon sun break through, casting a faint glow across the wet pavement that reflected back in soft, uneven patches, and the world seemed to move forward just a fraction, as if reminding them that time had not stopped entirely, only slowed. Rex took another small step, this time angling himself slightly more toward Ethan, his body aligning with the familiar rhythm of standing beside him rather than between them, and the lead, still loose, hung gently from Ethan's hand, no longer a point of tension, just a quiet link that did not need to be used. The man watched that shift, and for the first time since he had arrived, he stepped back, just half a step, giving the space room to settle into its new shape, not out of retreat, but out of respect for what had already been decided without words. Ethan noticed it, the deliberate nature of that movement, and something in his chest eased, not completely, but enough to allow a breath that felt less guarded. "You did not come here by accident," Ethan said, his voice calm, not accusatory, simply acknowledging what had become clear. The man shook his head slightly, his gaze dropping for a moment before lifting again, steady, open. "No," he admitted, and the honesty in that single word carried more weight than a longer explanation ever could. Rex's tail gave a slow, thoughtful movement, not the easy wag of comfort, but something measured, something that seemed to respond to the tone rather than the content, and Ethan felt it through the light contact at his leg, that subtle communication that had grown between them over time. The air felt different now, less charged, less uncertain, but not empty either, filled instead with a quiet understanding that whatever had brought them together in this moment had done its work, had revealed what needed to be seen, and did not require anything dramatic to follow. The man took another small step back, then paused, his eyes lingering on Rex for just a second longer, not asking, not expecting, simply acknowledging, and Rex met that gaze without lowering his head this time, without stepping forward, just holding it, steady, present, and then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, he turned his head away, not sharply, not with rejection, just enough to shift his focus back to Ethan, back to the life he stood in now. Ethan felt that movement more than he saw it, the quiet decision made without sound, and he did not speak, did not interrupt it, because some choices do not need to be explained to be understood. The man gave a small nod, more to himself than to either of them, and the faintest hint of a smile touched the edge of his expression, not wide, not forced, just enough to suggest that something inside him had settled too. "Take care of him," he said, and the words were simple, but they carried no instruction, no demand, only a quiet trust placed where it already existed. Ethan met his gaze and gave a slight nod in return, no words needed, because the answer had been clear long before it was spoken. The man turned then, not abruptly, not with finality, just a natural movement as he stepped away from the shelter, his figure blending slowly into the softened light of the street, the sound of his footsteps fading into the gentle hum of the world continuing on. Rex did not follow. He did not call out. He simply stood, steady and calm, his presence solid against Ethan's side, and after a moment, Ethan's hand moved once more, resting firmly against the dog's neck, not to guide, not to restrain, but to acknowledge what had just passed. Between them, something quiet, something unseen, something that did not need to be named to be real. The street did not rush back to life after the man disappeared. It returned slowly, like a tide that had been pulled away and was now finding its way back to shore, cautious, steady, carrying with it the quiet hum of a world that had never truly stopped, but had chosen to step aside for something it did not need to understand. Ethan remained where he was for a moment longer, his hand resting against Rex's neck, feeling the warmth beneath the fur, the steady rhythm of breath that had finally settled into something calm again, and there was a weight in that stillness, not heavy, not pressing, but meaningful in a way that did not need to be explained. Rex shifted slightly, not away, not forward, just enough to lean a fraction more into Ethan's side, the contact familiar now, grounding, and Ethan exhaled slowly, a breath he had not realized he had been holding since the moment the bus door opened. The light had softened across the pavement, the earlier gray replaced by a pale wash of gold that reflected off the damp surface in uneven patches, and somewhere in the distance, a car engine turned over, followed by the faint sound of tires rolling over wet bitumen. Ordinary sounds returning without ceremony. Ethan glanced down at Rex, studying him not as a handler, not as someone assessing behavior, but as a man trying to understand something that had just passed through both of them without warning. "You all right, mate?" he said quietly, the words gentle, not expecting an answer, just offering presence. Rex's ears flicked at the sound, and he turned his head slightly, just enough to meet Ethan's gaze for a brief moment. And in that look there was no confusion now, no searching, just a calm recognition of where he stood and who he stood beside. It was enough. Ethan nodded faintly, more to himself than to Rex, and his hand moved once, a slow, reassuring stroke along the dog's neck before settling again at his side. The lead hung loose between them, untouched, unnecessary, and after a moment, Ethan gathered it lightly, not to control, but to carry, looping it gently around. His fingers in a habit formed long ago. He took a step forward, away from the shelter, and Rex moved with him immediately, not hesitating, not looking back, simply aligning with the direction they had always taken together, and that quiet movement said more than anything that had happened before it. They walked slowly at first, boots making soft contact with the damp ground, the air cool but not cold, carrying that clean scent that follows rain in a coastal town, and the world unfolded around them in small, ordinary ways, a door closing somewhere nearby, a distant voice calling out, the faint rustle of leaves stirred by a light breeze. Ethan did not speak again, not because he had nothing to say, but because whatever needed to be understood had already found its place without words, and he knew better than to fill silence that was still settling. Rex's stride was steady now, even, the slight tension that had once lived in his movement gone, replaced by a quiet certainty that showed itself in the way he held his head, the way his tail moved in a slow, natural rhythm, neither high nor low, just balanced. They reached the corner where the street curved gently toward the coast, the faint sound of waves carrying across the air, soft and distant, and Ethan paused there for a moment, not out of hesitation, but out of habit, a place where he often stopped without thinking, as if the rhythm of his days had built itself around these small, unnoticed pauses. Rex stopped with him, standing close, his shoulder brushing lightly against Ethan's leg again, and for a moment they simply stood, looking out toward the stretch of road ahead, the sky beginning to clear in patches, revealing a softer blue behind the thinning clouds. Ethan glanced down again, his eyes tracing the familiar lines of Rex's face, the strong jaw, the steady eyes, the small scar near the ear that had never quite faded, and he thought, briefly, of the name that had been spoken, Arlo, how it had lingered in the air without taking hold, how it had touched something real without changing what was already there. Names mattered, he knew that, but they were not everything, not when something deeper had already taken root. You chose, did you? He said softly, not as a question that required an answer, but as a recognition of what had been decided in that quiet space back at the shelter. Rex's ear flicked again, and his tail gave a small, steady movement, the kind that did not seek attention, did not ask for praise, just acknowledged presence, and Ethan felt a faint warmth settle in his chest, not relief exactly, but something close to it, something that came from understanding rather than from resolution. The past had not disappeared, it had not been erased or undone, it had simply been seen, acknowledged, and then left where it belonged, not because it did not matter, but because it no longer needed to define what came next. Ethan turned slightly, adjusting his stance, and then continued walking, this time with a clearer sense of direction, not because anything ahead had changed, but because something behind him had been placed where it could no longer follow. Rex moved with him, as he always had, his presence steady, quiet, unwavering, and as they walked, the distance between what had been and what was became less of a divide and more of a line that had been crossed without needing to be marked. The light grew a little stronger as they moved further down the road, the damp ground beginning to dry in places, small patches of warmth breaking through where the sun reached the surface, and the world felt open again, not in a dramatic way, but in the simple, honest sense of space that comes after something has been carried for too long and finally set down. Ethan did not look back. He did not need to. Whatever had been waiting there had already revealed itself, had already spoken in the only way it could, and it had been enough. Rex walked beside him, not as Arlo, not as something returned, but as himself, as the dog who had chosen to stay, to move forward, to belong not to a memory, but to a life that continued step by step along a quiet street after the rain. And in that quiet movement, there was a kind of grace that did not ask to be noticed, only to be lived. The road curved gently toward the coastline, and with each step the sound of the sea grew clearer, not loud, not demanding, just steady, like a breath that had been there long before them and would remain long after. And Ethan let that rhythm settle into him, matching it without thinking, his stride easing into something slower, more deliberate, as if the weight he had carried earlier had thinned without needing to be dropped all at once. Rex walked close, not pressed in, not distant, just exactly where he chose to be, and that choice carried a quiet certainty that did not need to be tested again. The air had shifted since the rain, cleaner now, carrying a faint trace of salt that mixed with the warmth of the emerging sun, and the light stretched longer across the pavement, soft gold reflecting off shallow puddles that had not yet dried. Ethan glanced down once more, not out of concern, but out of habit, and Rex's eyes met his for a brief second. Calm, steady, no question left in them, and Ethan gave a small nod, a gesture so subtle it could have been missed by anyone else. But Rex responded with the slightest flick of his tail, as if the exchange had completed something unspoken. They reached the narrow path that led toward the shoreline, a strip of worn concrete edged with patches of grass still damp from the earlier drizzle, and Ethan turned onto it without hesitation, boots making a softer sound now against the ground, the rhythm of their movement changing again as the environment shifted around them. A few meters ahead, a bench faced the water, weathered wood darkened by years of salt air and rain, and Ethan slowed as they approached it, not because he needed to rest, but because something in the moment asked for stillness again, a different kind this time, not heavy, not uncertain, just quiet. Rex moved ahead by half a step, then stopped, turning slightly to align himself with Ethan as he paused beside the bench. And for a moment they stood there, looking out at the ocean, the surface calm, small waves folding gently onto the shore in a pattern that felt both constant and new. Ethan lowered himself onto the bench, the wood cool beneath him, and Rex remained standing at first, his posture relaxed but attentive, scanning the horizon briefly before stepping closer. And settling beside him, not fully lying down, just easing into a position that allowed him to remain aware while still at rest. The lead lay loosely across Ethan's hand, untouched, unnecessary, and after a moment he let it fall completely, the loop resting against his leg without tension. The silence here was different from the one at the bus stop, less charged, more open, like a space that invited thought without forcing it, and Ethan leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on his knees, eyes tracing the line where the water met the sky. "Funny thing about time," he said quietly, not looking at Rex, not expecting a response. "You think you have moved on from something, and then it just walks back into your day like it never left." Rex's ear flicked at the sound of his voice, but he did not shift position, his gaze remaining forward, steady, as if listening without needing to turn. Ethan let out a slow breath, watching it disappear into the air, and for a moment he allowed the memory to surface, not in full detail, not with clarity, but enough to acknowledge that it existed, that it had always been there, waiting for the right moment to be seen without resistance. The man's face, the way he had spoken, the name that had lingered between them, all of it settled into place now, not as something to solve, but as something that simply was. Rex shifted slightly beside him, leaning just enough for his shoulder to press lightly against Ethan's leg again, and Ethan's hand moved without thought, resting on the dog's back, fingers tracing a slow, familiar path through the fur. "You did not forget," Ethan murmured, the words soft, almost lost in the sound of the waves. "You just carried it differently." Rex exhaled quietly, a soft sound that blended with the rhythm of the ocean, and his body relaxed a fraction more, the last trace of tension easing away as if the act of being here, in this moment, was enough to settle what had been stirred. The light grew warmer as the sun edged higher, the sky clearing in patches that revealed a deeper blue beneath the thinning clouds, and a gull passed overhead, its call sharp but brief, a reminder that the world continued in its own way, unaffected by the quiet shifts that happened within it. Ethan straightened slightly, his gaze moving from the horizon back to Rex, studying him not as a handler assessing a companion, but as someone recognizing a presence that had chosen to stay through everything, through silence, through change, through moments that could have pulled them apart, but had not. "We keep going." "Yeah," he said, not as a command, not as a question, just a statement of what had already been decided, and Rex's tail moved once, slow and certain, the kind of movement that did not seek approval, only acknowledged understanding. Ethan nodded again, that same small gesture, and after a moment he stood, brushing a hand briefly against his jeans before reaching down to gather the lead, not tightening it, not guiding, just holding it as they stepped away from the bench. Rex rose smoothly, aligning himself once more at Ethan's side, his posture balanced, his stride even, and together they turned back toward the path, away from the water, not because they were leaving something behind, but because they were carrying it with them in a way that no longer weighed them down. The sound of the waves faded gradually as they moved further along the path, replaced by the quiet rhythm of their footsteps and the soft hum of a town returning to its usual pace, and the space between what had been and what was no longer felt like a gap to bridge, but a line that had been crossed without needing to look back. Rex walked beside Ethan, not pulled by memory, not defined by a name that had once belonged to him, but steady in the present, and Ethan matched that pace, not rushing, not slowing, just moving forward in a way that felt natural, as if this had always been the direction they were meant to take. And in that quiet movement, There was no need for resolution, no need for explanation. Only the simple, enduring truth that some bonds are not about where they began, but about where they choose to remain. The path curved back toward the town, and the sound of the ocean faded into something softer, like a memory that did not need to be held too tightly anymore. And Ethan walked without urgency, his pace steady, each step finding its place without thought, as if the ground itself knew where he needed to go. Rex stayed beside him, close but not pressed in, his movement fluid, unforced, the kind of stride that comes when nothing is pulling you away from where you stand. The air carried a faint warmth now, the sun settling more confidently between the thinning clouds, and the scent of salt gave way gradually to the familiar mix of damp pavement and distant eucalyptus, a quiet reminder that the world had already moved on from the rain. Ethan did not look back, not once, not because he was avoiding something, but because there was nothing left behind that needed his attention, and that in itself felt like a kind of answer. Rex's tail moved in a slow, easy rhythm, no hesitation, no pause, just a quiet consistency that matched the pace of their walk, and Ethan noticed it without needing to focus on it. The way you notice something that has become part of you without ever needing to question it. They passed a small corner shop, its door propped open, a faint hum of conversation drifting out, mixed with the soft clink of cups and the low murmur of a radio playing somewhere inside. And for a brief moment, the ordinary sound of it all felt almost unfamiliar, as if the world had been quieter than usual and was now remembering how to speak again. Ethan slowed slightly as they approached, not stopping, just letting the rhythm shift, and Rex adjusted with him instantly, the connection between them so natural it no longer required thought. A woman stepped out of the shop, pausing to adjust her bag before noticing Rex, her expression softening in that immediate, instinctive way people often had when they saw him. "Beautiful dog," she said with a small smile, her voice light, casual, carrying no weight beyond the moment. Ethan nodded in return, a brief acknowledgement. "Yeah, he is," he replied, his tone calm, simple, and Rex glanced briefly in her direction, ears flicking once before returning his focus forward, uninterested in attention that did not carry meaning. The woman moved on, her footsteps fading behind them, and the moment passed as easily as it had come, leaving no trace except the quiet confirmation of what Rex had become, not just a memory, not just a story, but a presence in the present, steady and complete. Ethan continued walking, his gaze moving ahead, not searching, not expecting, just observing the road as it unfolded. And for the first time since the bus stop, his shoulders felt fully at ease, the tension that had lingered earlier now gone in a way that did not feel like relief, but like balance restored. Rex shifted slightly closer again, his shoulder brushing against Ethan's leg for just a second, and Ethan's hand moved instinctively, resting briefly on the dog's back, a gesture so familiar it barely registered as a conscious act. "You always knew, did you?" he said quietly, not as a question that needed an answer, but as a reflection spoken aloud, and Rex's ear flicked in response, the smallest acknowledgement that still felt like understanding. The road ahead stretched gently upward, a slight incline that led toward a quieter part of the neighborhood, where the houses sat a little further apart, and the noise of the town softened into something more distant, and Ethan adjusted his stride slightly as they moved up, the effort minimal, almost welcome, like a reminder that movement itself could be grounding. The sun broke through more fully now, casting longer shadows behind them, and the damp ground began to dry in uneven patches, small areas of warmth spreading slowly across the surface, and Ethan felt that warmth through the soles of his boots, subtle but real. Rex's pace did not change, his breathing even, his presence steady, and there was something in that constancy that made everything else feel simpler, as if whatever questions had been stirred earlier no longer needed to be answered because they had already been understood. They reached a familiar stretch of pavement, the one that led toward Ethan's place, a small house set back from the road with a narrow garden out front. Nothing remarkable, nothing designed to stand out, just a place that existed quietly within its surroundings, and Ethan slowed again as they approached, not out of hesitation, but out of recognition, the kind that comes from returning, rather than arriving. Rex's ears lifted slightly, a subtle shift that marked the change in location, and his tail gave a small, steady movement, not excited, not restrained, just present, as if acknowledging that this was where the day would settle. Ethan reached the gate, pushing it open with a light touch, the hinge giving a soft, familiar sound, and Rex stepped through beside him without needing direction, his path already known, already chosen. The garden held the faint scent of damp soil and leaves, the plants still holding traces of rain, and the light filtered through in soft patches, creating small patterns on the ground that shifted as the breeze moved gently through the space. Ethan paused just inside, the gate closing behind them with a quiet click, and for a moment he stood there, looking at nothing in particular, just allowing the day to settle into its place. Rex stood beside him, not moving ahead, not wandering, just present, his body relaxed, his gaze calm, and Ethan let out a slow breath, one that felt complete in a way that earlier breaths had not. Home, he said quietly, the word simple, but carrying a weight that did not need to be explained. Rex's tail moved once, slow and certain, and he stepped forward then, not far, just enough to move into the space that belonged to him, his movement unhurried, confident, as if nothing that had happened earlier had altered where he stood now. Ethan watched him for a moment, a faint softness in his expression, and then followed, the door opening with a gentle push, the familiar interior waiting without change, without question. And as they stepped inside, leaving the quiet street and the fading light behind them, there was no sense of something unfinished, no lingering pull toward what had already passed, only the steady, grounded presence of what remained, and in that, there was a kind of peace that did not need to be spoken to be understood. The door closed behind them with a soft, familiar sound, the kind that did not echo but settled, like it belonged exactly where it was, and the house welcomed them in without ceremony, without question, holding the quiet warmth that only a lived-in place carries. The air inside was still, faintly scented with wood and something clean, a contrast to the salt and damp they had left outside, and Ethan stood for a moment just inside the doorway, letting that stillness reach him, letting it settle where the day had stirred something deeper than he had expected. Rex stepped in fully, his movement unhurried, paws soft against the wooden floor, and he paused just past the threshold, turning his head slightly as if to check that Ethan was there, not out of concern, but out of habit, a small gesture that had never needed to change. Ethan closed the door properly, the latch clicking into place, and he slipped the lead from his hand, hanging it on the same hook it always rested on. The motion automatic, grounding, a quiet return to routine. Rex watched the movement, ears flicking once, then moved further into the room, his path known, familiar, and he circled once near his usual spot before settling down, not fully lying flat, just resting in a way that kept him present, aware, but at ease. Ethan moved past him, his boots making a soft, steady sound against the floorboards, and he paused near the small table by the window, his gaze drifting outside for a moment, watching the last of the light shift across the garden, the damp leaves catching a soft glow as the sun lowered behind the rooftops. The world out there continued without pause, without knowledge of what had unfolded earlier, and there was something steadying in that, something that reminded him that not every moment needed to leave a mark on everything else. He exhaled slowly, his shoulders easing as the tension that had lingered through the afternoon finally released in full, not dramatically, not all at once, but in a way that felt complete. Rex shifted slightly on the floor, adjusting his position until he faced Ethan more directly, his gaze calm, steady, no trace of the earlier confusion left in it, and Ethan met that gaze without hesitation, something quiet passing between them that did not need to be spoken. "You are still you," Ethan said softly, the words simple, but carrying a certainty that felt earned rather than assumed, and Rex's tail moved once against the floor, a slow, steady motion that matched the calm in the room. Ethan moved to the kitchen without urgency, filling a kettle with water and setting it on the stove, the small, ordinary task grounding in its simplicity, and the faint sound of water moving, of metal settling into place, filled the space in a way that felt right, that felt necessary after the silence that had carried them through the day. Rex remained where he was, not following, not needing to, his presence steady even at a distance, and Ethan glanced back once, just to confirm what he already knew, that Rex was there, that nothing had shifted in a way that required attention. The kettle began to warm, a low hum building gradually, and Ethan rested his hands lightly against the counter, his mind not racing, not searching, just moving slowly through what had happened, not replaying it, not analyzing, just allowing it to exist as part of the day that had now begun to settle. He thought of the man, of the way he had stood, of the words he had chosen and the ones he had left unsaid, and there was no anger in that reflection, no resentment, just a quiet understanding that some stories do not end cleanly. They simply reach a point where they no longer need to continue. Rex's breathing was even now, steady, the kind of rhythm that comes when nothing inside is unsettled, and Ethan found himself listening to it, not consciously, but in the way you listen to something that reassures you without needing to ask for it. The kettle clicked softly as it reached temperature, a small, definitive sound that marked the completion of a simple task, and Ethan poured the water into a mug, the steam rising gently, carrying a faint warmth into the room. He leaned back slightly against the counter, holding the mug in both hands, feeling the heat settle into his palms, and for a moment he simply stood there, present, aware, without needing to move. Rex shifted again, this time lowering himself fully onto the floor, his body relaxed completely now, the earlier tension gone without leaving a trace, and Ethan watched him for a second longer, noting the way his eyes remained open, calm, aware, but no longer searching. "You remember," Ethan said quietly, more to himself than to the dog, "but you do not stay there." Rex's ears flicked once, the smallest acknowledgement, and his gaze softened slightly, as if the words had found their place without needing to be understood in the way humans understand things. Ethan took a slow sip from the mug, the warmth grounding, real, and he moved back toward the living area, settling into the chair near the window, the same place he had sat countless times before, and Rex did not move to follow, did not shift position. He simply remained where he was, steady, content, as if distance did not change the connection between them. Outside, the light continued to fade, the sky shifting into deeper tones, the last of the sun slipping away behind the line of houses, and the world softened into evening without drawing attention to itself. Ethan sat there, quiet, the events of the day no longer pressing, no longer asking for space, just existing as part of something larger, something that did not need to be resolved to be accepted. Rex closed his eyes slowly, not fully, just enough to rest while still remaining aware, and the room held that stillness, that quiet balance, where nothing needed to be added or taken away. And in that space, in that simple, unremarkable moment, there was a kind of understanding that did not come from answers, but from presence, from the steady, enduring truth that what remains is not always what was first given, but what is chosen again and again, in the quiet moments that follow everything else. The evening settled in quietly, not with a sudden drop of darkness, but with a gradual softening of everything. The edges of the room dimming as the last light slipped through the window and gave way to the muted glow of the lamps Ethan had not yet turned on, and for a while he remained where he was, sitting still, the warmth of the mug fading slowly in his hands as the day continued to release its hold on him. Rex had not moved much, only the slight rise and fall of his breathing marking the passage of time, his body relaxed but never fully unaware, the kind of rest that came from trust rather than exhaustion, and Ethan found himself watching that rhythm again, not out of concern, but because it grounded him in a way nothing else quite did. The house held a quiet that felt complete, not empty, not waiting, just settled, and outside the faint sound of the street carried on, distant footsteps, a car door closing somewhere down the road, the low hum of life continuing without interruption. Ethan placed the mug down on the small table beside him, the ceramic making a soft contact with the surface, and he leaned back slightly in the chair, his gaze drifting once more toward the window where the sky had deepened into a richer shade of blue, the first hints of evening settling fully into place. He did not feel the need to turn on the lights yet. There was something in this dimness that felt right, something that matched the quiet understanding that had formed throughout the day, not asking for clarity, not demanding answers, just allowing things to exist as they were. Rex shifted then, a slow, deliberate movement as he adjusted his position, turning slightly so that he faced Ethan more directly again, his eyes opening fully now, clear, steady, and Ethan met that gaze without hesitation, something unspoken passing between them that felt more certain than any words could have been. "You are not carrying it anymore," Ethan said softly, his voice low, almost blending into the stillness of the room, and Rex's ears flicked once, a subtle acknowledgement, his gaze remaining calm, present, no longer searching for something beyond what was already here. Ethan let out a quiet breath, one that felt lighter than before, and he ran a hand briefly over his face, the motion slow, thoughtful, before letting it rest again on the arm of the chair. There was no need to revisit what had happened, no need to replay the moment at the bus stop, because whatever had needed to be understood had already settled into place, not as a conclusion, but as a quiet acceptance. Rex rose slowly then, not abruptly, not with urgency, just a natural shift from rest to movement, and he walked over to Ethan with the same steady pace he had carried all day, stopping just beside him before lowering himself again, this time closer, his head resting lightly near Ethan's knee. The contact was small, almost insignificant to an outside eye, but Ethan felt it fully, the weight of it, the intention behind it, and his hand moved down instinctively, resting against Rex's head, fingers settling into the fur with a familiarity that needed no adjustment. "Yeah," Ethan murmured, not quite a word, not quite a sound, just an acknowledgement of something that did not need to be named. The room held that moment without interruption, the quiet deepening in a way that felt natural rather than forced, and outside the last traces of light faded completely, leaving the window as a dark reflection of the space inside rather than a view beyond it. Ethan remained where he was, his posture relaxed, his breathing even, and for the first time since the day had begun, there was no sense of something unfinished, no lingering question waiting to be answered, only the steady presence of what was already here. Rex's breathing slowed again as he settled more fully, his body relaxing into the floor, his eyes half closed but still aware, and Ethan noticed the way the tension that had once lived in those small details was no longer there, replaced by something quieter, something that felt complete. He thought, briefly, of the man again, not with sharpness, not with confusion, just with a distant awareness, like remembering a place you had once been without feeling the need to return, and there was no pull in that thought, no unfinished thread, just a quiet recognition that some connections exist without needing to be carried forward. Ethan shifted slightly in his chair, adjusting his position so that he could rest more comfortably, and the movement caused the light from the nearby lamp to catch the edge of the tattoo on his forearm, the image of the German shepherd etched there, worn but clear, a reminder of something chosen, something kept. He glanced at it for a moment, not analyzing, not reflecting deeply, just noticing, and then his gaze returned to Rex, to the real presence beside him, steady and alive in a way no image could ever fully capture. "Still here," Ethan said quietly, the words simple, but carrying a depth that came from everything that had passed between them, and Rex's tail gave a slow, soft movement against the floor, a response that did not need to be seen to be felt. The house remained still, the air calm, and time moved forward in that gentle, unremarkable way it always does, not marking the moment, not highlighting it, just allowing it to exist as part of the ongoing rhythm of their lives. And in that quiet, in that steady presence, there was no need for anything more, no need for a conclusion or a declaration. Only the understanding that what mattered had already been chosen, not once, not in a single moment, but again and again, in the small, quiet ways that do not ask to be noticed, only to be lived. The night settled fully without announcement, the kind of quiet arrival that does not ask for attention, only presence, and the room adjusted to it naturally, shadows softening along the walls, the faint glow from a single lamp casting a warm circle that did not reach every corner but did not need to. Ethan remained seated, his posture relaxed in a way that came from something deeper than rest, and Rex stayed close, his breathing steady, his presence constant, not demanding, not distant, just there in the way that mattered most. Outside, the world had dimmed into a quieter rhythm, the occasional passing car, the distant murmur of voices carried briefly through the night air before fading again, and none of it felt intrusive, None of it disrupted the stillness that had settled inside the house. Ethan leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on his knees, his gaze lowering not toward anything specific, just into the space between moments, where thoughts do not rush but arrive slowly, if they arrive at all. Rex shifted his head just enough to rest more fully against Ethan's leg, the contact gentle but certain, and Ethan's hand moved without thought, fingers settling against the familiar shape of the dog's head, tracing a slow line behind the ear before resting there. "Strange day," Ethan murmured, the words quiet, almost a reflection more than a statement, and Rex's ear flicked once in response, the small movement enough to acknowledge without interrupting the calm. The house held that exchange without echo, without weight, just allowing it to exist as part of the quiet that filled the space. Ethan's gaze drifted toward the window again, though now it reflected only the room itself, the faint outline of his own figure and Rex beside him, layered against the darkness beyond, and for a moment he studied that reflection, not with curiosity, but with a quiet recognition of what stood in front of him, what remained unchanged even after the day had shifted something deeper beneath the surface. He thought again of the name, not as a question, not as something unresolved, but as a piece of a story that had reached its place without needing to continue. And he realized that what had mattered was not whether Rex had been something else once, but that he had chosen, in the only way he knew how, where to stand now. Rex exhaled slowly, a soft breath that carried through the stillness, and his body relaxed further, the last trace of alertness fading into rest that was complete, unguarded, and Ethan felt that shift as clearly as if it had been spoken aloud. "You are not divided," Ethan said quietly, the words forming without effort, not directed as a command or a question, just an acknowledgement of something that had settled into place, and Rex's tail moved once against the floor, a slow, steady motion that matched the calm of the room. Ethan let out a small breath, almost a quiet laugh without sound, and leaned back again, his shoulders easing into the chair as the day finally released whatever it had been holding on to. There was no urge to move, no need to fill the silence, only the steady awareness of being present in a moment that did not ask for anything more. The lamp flickered slightly as a breeze moved faintly through the edges of the house, and the shadows shifted just enough to remind him that even stillness has movement within it, subtle, continuous, unnoticed unless you choose to look. Rex did not stir at the change, his breathing even, his presence anchored, and Ethan found himself listening again, not out of habit, but because it felt like the simplest truth available to him, that this steady rhythm beside him was real, unchanged by memory, untouched by what had passed earlier. He reached down once more, his hand resting more firmly now against Rex's neck, not to reassure, not to check, but to acknowledge, to ground himself in something that did not shift with time or circumstance. "We are all right," Ethan said softly, the words carrying a quiet certainty that did not need confirmation, and Rex's ear flicked again, a small, almost imperceptible response that still felt complete. The night deepened outside, the distant sounds fading further into the background, and the house seemed to settle with it, the air growing cooler, the space more still, as if everything had found its place for the hours ahead. Ethan remained where he was, not thinking ahead, not looking back, just existing in the present in a way that felt enough, and for a while there was nothing but the quiet, the steady breathing beside him, and the faint hum of a world that did not need to be understood to be accepted. Eventually, without urgency, he shifted in his seat, setting the empty mug aside and rising slowly, the movement unhurried, natural, and Rex responded immediately, lifting his head, eyes opening fully, not startled, not alert, just aware, ready to follow as he always did. Ethan stepped toward the hallway, the light from the lamp stretching briefly across the floor as he moved, and Rex stood, his body aligning with Ethan's direction without hesitation, the connection between them unchanged, unbroken. They moved through the house together, the quiet following them rather than being left behind. And when Ethan paused briefly at the doorway to glance back at the dimly lit room, there was no sense of something unfinished, no lingering pull, only the quiet understanding that everything that needed to settle had already done so. Rex stood beside him, steady, present, and Ethan gave a small nod, not to the dog, not to the room, but to the moment itself, and then he turned away, stepping forward into the deeper quiet of the night, carrying with him nothing more and nothing less than what had chosen to remain. The hallway held a softer darkness, the kind that did not obscure but quieted everything it touched. And Ethan moved through it without turning on the lights, his steps measured, familiar, guided more by memory than sight, and Rex followed close, his presence a steady shadow beside him, not leading, not lagging, simply matching each step with quiet certainty. The floorboards gave a faint, gentle sound beneath their weight, a small reminder that movement still existed even in the stillness, and the air carried a subtle coolness that came with the deepening night, brushing lightly against skin and fur alike. Ethan paused near the doorway of the bedroom, not out of hesitation, but out of habit, a brief still point before entering a space that belonged to rest, to letting go of the day entirely, and Rex stopped with him, his posture relaxed, his gaze lifting briefly toward Ethan's face as if checking, not for permission, but for alignment. Ethan exhaled slowly, a breath that carried no tension now, only a quiet release, and he stepped inside, the room receiving him with the same unspoken familiarity as the rest of the house. The curtains were partially drawn, allowing a faint trace of moonlight to slip through, casting a pale line across the floor that shifted gently with the breeze, and Ethan moved toward the side of the bed, his movements unhurried, deliberate, as if there was no need to rush toward rest because it was already waiting. Rex entered behind him, pausing just inside before crossing the room to his usual place near the foot of the bed, circling once in a slow, thoughtful motion before lowering himself down, his body settling into the floor with a quiet ease that showed no trace of the earlier day's disturbance. Ethan sat on the edge of the bed for a moment, his hands resting loosely against his knees, his gaze lowered, not fixed on anything, just allowing the final fragments of the day to pass through without resistance, without being held. There was no replay of events, no attempt to piece together what had already found its place, only a gentle awareness that something had shifted, not in a way that changed everything, but in a way that clarified what had always been true beneath the surface. Rex adjusted slightly on the floor, his head resting against his front paws, his eyes half closed but still aware, and Ethan glanced down at him, the quiet connection between them steady, unchanged, and something in that steadiness felt like the answer to a question he had not known how to ask before. "You stayed," Ethan said softly, the words simple, almost a whisper, but carrying a weight that came from understanding rather than from doubt, and Rex's tail moved once against the floor, a slow, gentle acknowledgement that did not need to be repeated. Ethan leaned back slightly, his shoulders easing, and he ran a hand briefly along his forearm, fingers brushing over the tattoo there, the image worn but clear, and for a moment he held that contact, not as a reflection of the past, but as a recognition of something chosen, something carried forward without needing to be questioned. The room remained quiet, the air still, and outside the faint sounds of the night continued in their distant, unintrusive way, a reminder that the world did not pause. It simply moved around moments like this without disturbing them. Ethan stood slowly, moving toward the window, his hand lifting to adjust the curtain just slightly, allowing a little more of the moonlight to enter, softening the edges of the room further, and he looked out for a brief moment, not searching, not expecting, just acknowledging the space beyond the glass. There was no figure waiting there, no presence lingering from earlier, only the quiet street, the faint outline of trees, and the steady, distant glow of a streetlight casting its own small circle of light onto the pavement. Ethan let the curtain fall back into place, the movement gentle, final, and he turned back toward the room, toward Rex, who had not moved, who remained exactly where he had chosen to be. "All right," Ethan murmured, not as a statement to begin something new, but as a quiet closing of what had already ended, and Rex's ear flicked once more, the small motion enough to acknowledge without needing to shift from rest. Ethan moved to the side of the bed again, sitting briefly before leaning back, his body settling into the mattress, the weight of him absorbed without resistance, and for a moment, he lay there without closing his eyes, simply existing in the quiet, the events of the day no longer pressing, no longer asking to be understood. Rex's breathing remained steady, a soft rhythm that filled the space in a way that felt grounding, and Ethan listened to it without focusing, the sound blending into the stillness around him. There was no tension left, no edge to the silence, only a calm that felt earned, not given. And as he finally closed his eyes, it was not to escape the day, but to rest within it, to allow it to settle fully into memory without needing to hold on to it. Rex shifted once more, a small adjustment as he settled deeper into his place, his body fully relaxed now, his presence steady even in rest, and the room held that quiet, that balance, without change. The night continued outside, the world moving forward in its own rhythm, and inside, nothing needed to move at all. And in that stillness, in that quiet, there was no division between what had been and what remained, only the simple, enduring truth that some bonds are not defined by where they begin, but by where they choose to stay, even when everything else has had the chance to leave. The night did not feel heavy as it deepened. It felt settled, like everything that needed to move had already done so, and what remained was simply still, held in a quiet balance that did not ask for attention. Ethan lay on his back, eyes closed but not fully asleep, his breathing slow, even, the kind that comes when the mind no longer reaches for anything beyond the present moment. The room held that silence without strain, the faint line of moonlight shifting slightly across the floor as the hours passed, marking time in a way that did not interrupt it. Rex remained where he had settled, his body relaxed, his breathing steady, and for a long while nothing changed, nothing needed to. Somewhere outside, a distant car moved along the road, its sound soft and brief, fading quickly into the background, and the house returned to its quiet without resistance. Ethan's mind did not replay the day in detail. It moved instead in fragments, impressions rather than events, the sense of something recognized, something released, something allowed to rest where it belonged. The name that had surfaced earlier no longer lingered with weight. It existed now as a memory that had found its place without needing to be held onto. And in that quiet acceptance, there was no tension left around it. Rex shifted slightly in his sleep, a small adjustment, his paw moving just a fraction before settling again. And Ethan felt it without opening his eyes, the subtle movement enough to remind him that presence does not fade simply because it is no longer being watched. Still here, he murmured softly, the words barely more than a breath, not intended to be heard, only to be acknowledged, and Rex's ear flicked once in response. Even in rest, a small, instinctive recognition that required no further action. Time moved gently through the space, unmarked, uninterrupted, and gradually the line between wakefulness and rest softened for Ethan, his body easing further into the mattress, his thoughts quieting until they no longer formed clearly at all. The house remained unchanged, the air still, the night carrying on beyond the walls without pressing in. At some point, the darkness shifted, not suddenly, but with a gradual lightening that spoke of early morning rather than night's end, and the faintest hint of gray began to replace the deeper tones in the room. Ethan's breathing remained steady, but there was a subtle change in it, the natural adjustment that comes before waking, and Rex stirred again, this time more fully, lifting his head slightly before settling back down, as if sensing the shift without needing to respond to it yet. The quiet held, softer now, carrying the beginning of a new day without announcing it, and Ethan opened his eyes slowly, not startled, not pulled from sleep, but returning to awareness in the same calm way he had entered it. The room was dim, but no longer dark, the outlines of familiar shapes visible again, the soft line of light near the window marking the presence of morning just beyond the glass. Ethan did not move immediately. He simply lay there for a moment, allowing the stillness to remain, to settle into this new hour as naturally as it had settled into the last. Rex lifted his head again, this time fully awake, his gaze turning toward Ethan, clear, steady, and Ethan met that gaze without speaking, something quiet passing between them that needed no words. The events of the previous day did not return with force, they did not demand attention. They simply existed in the background, acknowledged, understood, but no longer present in a way that required thought. Ethan exhaled slowly, a breath that felt complete, and he pushed himself up to sit, the movement unhurried, natural, his body responding without resistance. Rex rose as well, stretching lightly before stepping closer, his presence aligning once again with Ethan's without hesitation, without question, as if nothing had changed and everything had been clarified at the same time. Ethan swung his legs over the side of the bed, his feet meeting the floor with a soft, familiar contact, and he rested his hands briefly against his knees, pausing in that simple, grounded position before standing fully. "Morning," he said quietly, not as a greeting that required response, but as a recognition of what had arrived, and Rex's tail moved once, a slow, steady motion that matched the calm in the room. The light outside grew slightly stronger, filtering in through the edges of the curtain, and Ethan moved toward the window, drawing it back just enough to let the early morning in, the cool air brushing lightly against his skin, carrying with it the faint scent of damp earth and something new. Rex stood beside him, looking out without tension, without searching, simply present, and Ethan glanced down briefly, a small, quiet acknowledgement of the steady presence that had not shifted, had not wavered. "We keep going," Ethan murmured, the words simple, but carrying the quiet certainty of someone who no longer needed to question what that meant, and Rex remained beside him, steady, calm, as the first light of the new day settled into the room, not as a beginning, but as a continuation of something that had already found its place. The morning did not rush in, it unfolded gently, like a breath drawn slowly after a long night, and the light that entered the room carried no urgency, only clarity, soft and steady, settling over everything without asking to be noticed. Ethan stood by the window for a moment longer, the curtain drawn just enough to let the early sun stretch across the floor in quiet lines, and Rex remained beside him, still, grounded, his gaze moving across the small garden outside without tension, without searching for anything beyond what was already there. The air felt different now, lighter, not because something had been removed, but because something had been understood, placed where it no longer needed to be carried. Ethan let out a slow breath, the kind that does not mark an ending, but a continuation, and he stepped back from the window, turning toward the room with a quiet certainty that did not need to be spoken. Rex followed immediately, not waiting, not hesitating, his movement aligned with Ethan's without question, the connection between them unchanged, unbroken, and in that simple motion there was a kind of truth that no explanation could match. They moved through the house together, the familiar rhythm of morning settling around them in small, ordinary ways, the soft sound of the kettle being filled, the faint creak of the floorboards beneath their steps, the subtle shift of light as the sun rose higher beyond the walls. Ethan moved without rush, each action deliberate but unforced, as if the day ahead did not need to be planned, only lived, and Rex remained close, not as something that needed to be guided, but as something that chose to be there, step by step, moment by moment. The kettle began to hum softly, a low, steady sound that filled the quiet without breaking it, and Ethan rested his hand briefly against the counter, feeling the cool surface beneath his palm, grounding himself in the simplicity of the moment. Rex settled nearby, not lying down fully, just standing in a relaxed posture, his ears flicking occasionally at the small sounds of the house, his presence calm, steady, complete. Ethan glanced down at him, a faint softness in his expression, not dramatic, not exaggerated, just real, and he gave a small nod, the kind that does not signal anything new, only acknowledges what has already been decided. "We are right where we are meant to be," he said quietly, the words simple, but carrying a weight that came not from belief, but from experience, and Rex's tail moved once in response, a slow, certain motion that matched the calm in the room. The kettle clicked softly as it reached temperature, and Ethan poured the water into a mug, the steam rising gently, catching the light in soft, shifting patterns before fading into the air, and for a moment he watched it, not because it mattered, but because it existed, and that was enough. Rex shifted slightly, stepping closer, his shoulder brushing lightly against Ethan's leg, and Ethan's hand moved down instinctively, resting against the dog's back, the contact steady, familiar, unspoken. "Come on," Ethan murmured, not as a command, not as a request, just an invitation to continue, and Rex moved with him as they stepped toward the door, the world outside waiting without expectation. The morning air met them gently as the door opened, cool and clean, carrying the faint scent of damp soil and leaves, and the garden held the quiet traces of the night that had just passed, the ground still slightly darkened, the plants catching the early light in small, uneven patches. Ethan stepped out, Rex beside him, and for a moment they stood there, not moving forward, not looking back, just present in the space between what had been and what would come next. There was no weight in that space now, no pull from the past, no uncertainty about the future, only the steady, grounded awareness of where they stood. Rex's gaze moved briefly across the garden, then returned to Ethan, not questioning, not searching, simply aligning, and Ethan met that gaze with the same quiet certainty that had carried them through everything before. "All right," he said softly, the words simple, but complete, and Rex's tail moved once more, the motion steady, unforced, as they stepped forward together, out into the day. The gate opened with a familiar sound, the street beyond calm, unchanged, the world continuing as it always had, and Ethan walked without hesitation, his stride even, his presence grounded, and Rex moved beside him, not as something that followed, but as something that walked with him, equal in the quiet understanding they shared. The light grew stronger as they moved, the sky clearing fully now, the blue stretching open above them, and the road ahead held nothing extraordinary, no sign of what had passed, no trace of what had been revealed, only the simple, steady path of another day. And in that simplicity, there was something more lasting than any moment of recognition, more enduring than any memory